All right, good afternoon. Today here at Richmond Community College, we have the pleasure of welcoming a scholar who's a very busy man, chair of social sciences at Cape Fear Community College, all the way in Wilmington, North Carolina. He's going to talk to us about Native American identity in North Carolina. And we're very grateful to Thomas Massey for taking the time out of his schedule this end of semester to talk to us. But I think I've talked enough. Mr. Massey, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yarbrough. And it is my honor to be here with you guys today. I wanted to very briefly introduce you to how I became interested in the topic of Native American identity in North Carolina. I came into UNC Wilmington for grad school studying history, and while I was there, it was a huge revelation to me to realize that Native Americans in this state operated and maintained completely separate, segregated Indian schools throughout the era of racial segregation, Jim Crow segregation. And that went all the way up through to UNC Pembroke, which is actually the first four-year school dedicated to Native Americans in the entire country. And so many, many years ago, when I was writing my thesis, I took a closer look at this school system, and in particular, I was interested in the process of desegregation, because you tend to think of desegregation as being a good thing, a civil rights victory, and yet for Native Americans, I found through a series of interviews within the community that for an awful lot of people, school desegregation represented a crisis within their communities. Their schools were very much their own creation, and they were a vital way of proving their Native American identity in lieu of federal or even state recognition at that time. So that's really where my interest lay. And today my presentation is going to focus on the historical efforts of American Indians living in North Carolina to gain recognition from broader society of their racial identity. Thousands of American Indians living in North Carolina have historically had their racial identity disputed, rejected, or ignored. Unlike the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, most of the 184,000 North Carolinians who identified as American Indian on the 2010 census do not live on a reservation. Instead, we find they practice Christianity, speak the English language exclusively, intermarry with African Americans, intermarry with whites, and are fully assimilated into mainstream socioeconomic structures. Now, 3 weeks ago, the US House of Representatives unanimously voted in favor of the Lumbee Recognition Act, a bipartisan bill sponsored by Democrat G.K. Butterfield and Republican Dan Bishop. Now, if this bill passes the US Senate, the Lumbee tribe would most likely be eligible for federal funds and grants to help with workforce development, healthcare, and education. And there is a pushback. And so here, in a quote that I found in the Robesonian, Richard Snead, Principal Chief of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, has written, "Passage of the so-called Lumbee Recognition Act by the House of Representatives sets a dangerous precedent that endangers the sovereignty and culture of all Native nations. The group of people calling themselves Lumbees have never provided any substantial evidence of descendancy from any of the historical tribes." Now, the Lumbee are not new arrivals to the state of North Carolina. So why, number one, is the federal government only just now getting around to granting the Lumbee full federal recognition? And why is this resented by the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, or at least Richard Snead, their principal chief? And what about other Native American tribes in the state? Why is it that the census of 2010 revealed 184,000 people who identified as American Indian in North Carolina, and yet only the 13,000 Eastern Band of Cherokee have full federal recognition? North Carolina, in fact, has been home to a diverse array of American Indians who forged communities on this land far before Sir Walter Raleigh funded a first failed attempt at colonization on Roanoke Island. 2 years before the U.S. Constitution was ratified, the new American government forged a treaty with the Cherokee, the 1785 Treaty of Hopewell. Article 1 and 2 arranged for the exchange of prisoners of war on both sides. And then the treaty swiftly recognized the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation and acknowledged that the Cherokee had the right to punish any American citizen refusing to respect this. Thus, we can see that this was a piece of legislation, a treaty that was born out of war. The Cherokee have always had federal recognition. This was a military necessity from 1785 onward. Now, most ancestors of the 184,000 North Carolinians today with American Indian lineage did not represent a significant military threat to the U.S. government. And rather than retaining traditional languages and religions, they strove to assimilate with dominant white society. In fact, even the Cherokee invited Christian missionaries to their nation and adapted their economic and social realities to the systems around them. Hence, rather controversially, it's very easy to find successful Cherokees who in fact became slave-owning plantation owners. North Carolinian American Indians came to be defined by the state legislatures as, quote, free persons of mixed blood from 1835. This obviously is not the group that the Cherokees fell under. They had federal recognition, but for all other groups, free persons of mixed blood. Now, on the one hand, this designation protected them from being rounded up as escaped slaves, but on the other hand, it also clearly set them apart from white privilege, denying them the right to vote, to bear arms, to testify in court, hold public office, or attend schools for white children. In 1885, State Representative Hamilton McMillan convinced the General Assembly that the Indians of Robeson County were in fact descendants of both the Croatan Indians and English survivors of Sir Walter Raleigh's lost colony, highlighting the oral history of descendants of the Lumbee, the work of historian John Lawson, and the prevalence of English family names among these Indians, such as Locklear, Moore, Jacobs, Dial, Oxendine. Now, once recognized as Croatan Indians, the state legislatures, conforming to late 19th century racial mores, established a fund for separate Indian schools. By 1887, the origins of Pembroke State University were born in the building of the Croatan Normal, or Teacher Training, School. Other American Indian communities sought to retain their unique racial heritage also by establishing their own private schools, rather than send their children to segregated schools for black children. Now, if you look at this map right here, we can just very quickly go through some of the major areas where Native Americans have historically lived in this state. So if you look up in the north, we have Person County on the border with Virginia. That's where the Saponi historically have made their home. You can see that the Haliwa Saponi, in fact, draw their name from a combination of Warren counties and Halifax counties, Haliwa Saponi, both drawing on geography and tribal affiliation. Next door to them in Hartford County are the Meherrin. Then if we work our way south, we can see that the most populous group, the Lumbee, occupy Robeson County, Scotland County, Hoke County, and Cumberland County. If we move down south just a little bit to Columbus and Bladen counties, these are the historic regions for the Waccamaw-Siouan. And then if we drift further north to Sampson and Harnett counties, these are where the Coharie have made their home for many, many generations. And here are just a few images of the school systems that historically were built by Native American communities in these counties. The Shiloh Indian Sunday School and dates back to the early 1900s to provide the Coharie children with a school system. And the second one you can see is a 1948 photo of High Plains Indian School, which was first established for the Saponi Indians in the late 1880s. Evidence of the importance of these schools to prove racial identity can be found in particular by looking at the trials and tribulations the Waccamaw-Siouan faced with both the Columbus and Bladen County Boards of Education. In 1891, the Waccamaw-Siouan built a one-room private school that was often closed due to lack of funds to pay a teacher. Theodore Purdue found that their rate of tuition was supposed to be $40 annually, and that just proved to be too much for many parents. In 1921, the Columbus County Board of Education offered a teacher for the Waccamaw-Siouan school. But when American Indians realized the teacher was African American, they angrily closed the school. Just as white communities would not accept black teachers, the Waccamaw-Siouan demonstrated that their school represented their distinct Indian heritage. What particularly fascinates me is that the Halliwah-Saponi gained support for a separate Indian school, the Halliwah Public School, in 1957. That is a full 3 years after the landmark Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling that desegregated schools. It seems that North Carolina finally retroactively regretted not providing separate and equal schools and was trying retroactively to provide that after the Supreme Court ruling. This school, in fact, would close down in 1969 due to pressures at the federal level to desegregate. But demonstrating that schools still today in 2020 play a central role in strengthening tribal identity. In the year 2000, the same Halliwah-Saponi tribal school was reopened as a charter school, and today it integrates American Indian Studies into the core curriculum. So ironically, we can see that the civil rights campaigns to desegregate schools represented a fundamental threat to the racial identity of Native peoples in North Carolina, since the schools were the only real official recognition of their true racial identity. As Indian schools began to be shut down as educational centers, the buildings were often converted into tribal headquarters, which led successful campaigns to gain state, if not federal, recognition as distinct tribal entities during the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so a fundamental question is, how was it that these Native American peoples in North Carolina were able to gain state recognition, and yet federal recognition remained elusive? On this next slide, you can see the criteria laid out by the Federal Acknowledgement Branch for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And if we go through these points, you can see that for American Indians to prove their tribal identity, they have to establish continuous historical identification as American Indian. The school systems are really one of the key elements in proof of that historical identification as a separate tribal entity. They also have to establish that a significant proportion of the group live in a specific area or community viewed as American Indian, that there has been tribal political influence within the group. They have to provide a governing document and criteria for membership. You have to list all members, show that those members are not part of any other tribes, and that they have not been terminated in the past, which is a shorthand term for saying that there was a point in time when the federal government paid what they felt they owed to tribal entities, and therefore those entities ended their relationship with the federal government. In my opinion, it will actually become harder and harder for North Carolinian American Indians to claim federal recognition. And it is for a variety of reasons. Key to that reason is that there are general trends both within North Carolina and nationally that trend toward a new multiculturalism. So, for instance, in the 2010 census, 62,000, or about a third of the 184,000 North Carolinians who identified as American Indian, also claimed another racial category in addition to being American Indian. And we see that this is repeated at the national level. So of 5.2 million people who identify in 2010 as American Indian in the entire country, 2.3 million of them also claimed multiracial identities. And so what we can draw from this is that modern American Indians do not limit their marriage partners to a specific race. And so, fundamentally, I think we need to acknowledge that blood is becoming increasingly irrelevant to American Indian racial identity today. We need to acknowledge that race is a social construct rather than a biological reality. When Cook County Hospital in Chicago first developed a blood bank in 1937, the hospital recognized the 8 major blood groups, such as A positive, B, O, and so forth. And additionally, they noted the race of the donor and separated blood accordingly. Now, this practice of segregating blood by race as well as type would continue throughout the country, despite the chairman of the American Red Cross admitting to Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1930s that it was, quote, a matter of tradition and sentiment rather than of science, end of quote. By 1950, the Red Cross recognized that dividing blood by race was no longer acceptable. Receiving a blood transfusion from someone of a different race will not change the skin color of offspring. Simply put, racial identity is decided by societal norms rather than a blood test. It would be easy to argue from a biological perspective that someone like past President Barack Obama is as equally white as he is black. After all, he had a white mother and a father from Kenya. And yet, no blood test or genetic ancestry tests determined his racial identity. Society determined from the color of his skin that he was a black man, is a black man. American Indians in North Carolina have effectively shown that they can marry outside of their racial communities, embrace mainstream societal norms, and yet maintain a vibrant identity as Native American. And so this last slide here really is to show that multiracialism does not diminish Indian identity. Here I have a very simple compilation of some of the major tribes in North Carolina today. This is their online presence, and you can easily search out the Lumbee, the Coharie, the Meherrin, the Waccamaw-Siouan, the Halliwah-Saponi, the Saponi Indians of Person County, and you can see that today they can intermarry with black communities, with white communities, with international communities, and it does not diminish their Native American identity. And so I'm going to leave it at this point and turn the floor over to questions.
Well, first, I wanted to thank you very much, Mr. Massey, for this fascinating discussion of a subject which we see is very much topical. We'll see how the Senate votes. And we'll see. Do you know, by the way, if the Biden administration has said, or the forming Biden administration has offered any position on this law?
I have not heard from the Biden administration. I do know that Trump has said that he would sign the bill if it moved through the Senate, which is interesting. We've had bills like this before, and they've passed the House and always stumbled when it comes to the Senate. We had partial recognition in 1956, but I think the stumbling block really comes down to funding it. And
Yes.
If we're looking at the tensions with people like the Eastern Band of Cherokee, my assumption is that they feel very threatened by the fact that if you include large numbers of additional people, but you don't add the additional funding in, then that is going to cut the funding to other established Native American communities.
I think it's very interesting you raise the issue of financial dilution as being the stumbling block rather than it being something relating to blood or something relating to culture. Again, this is not an area of expertise for me, but just reading a bit about the history of the Lumbee, I see that in Southern Utah University, Mark Miller argues that the very fact that the Lumbee are defined from the 1830s on as being of mixed blood, Mark Miller argues that African-American ancestry among the Lumbee was the fundamental stumbling block for recognition in the Jim Crow era. I don't know what's your take on that?
Yes, so I think that there has always been a tension, and this is both within Native American communities and in mainstream society. I think that there are a lot of enduring stereotypes about what Native Americans should present as. When you get people like Heather Locklear, I don't know if you're familiar with, she was an actress way back in the day, Melrose Place. White, blue-eyed, blonde hair, but you can see from her last name, she claimed Lumbee ancestry. I think this is a stumbling block for an awful lot of people, both within Native American communities and outside. This idea that whether people present looking black or looking white, that they somehow do not qualify for being Native American. And my point really is that all Native American communities are going to have to confront this at some point, because in our age of increasing multiracial identities, the alternative is that we will cease to recognize Native Americans as a separate cultural heritage.
Yeah, and if you want to talk about the physical presentation, I read that in the 30s that there were physical examinations that physical anthropologist by the name of Carl Seltzer conducted on a group of Lumbee people, women, children as well. Really kinds of stuff that, well, unfortunately fits into what we think of the 30s, I suppose, in a way. But yes, I guess I suppose today it's really the continuity and it's continuity and culture, I suppose, really more than anything else.
Right. So I think what we're seeing within North Carolinian Native Americans today is in many ways, it's a mature approach to a more multicultural identity, still celebrating Native American heritage. In some ways, we can see that in the past, there was a lot of I don't really want to use the word shame, but I think a lot of people struggled with the idea of being even Native American. They tended to be on the peripheries of society. It's only really been since the 1970s, and with the civil rights movement, whether we're talking about the African American civil rights movement or the Red Power movement following it, that today it has become very cachet to claim Native American ancestry, and it doesn't diminish your life chances. But you can see in the 1830s, 1840s, 50s, in this very segregated society that still had slavery, any association with any race other than white, obviously, was to set you back into a second-class citizenship. And the legacies of that, I think we can see, were still continuing on right into the 1950s.
I wanted to ask you a question, if I could, about identity beyond federal recognition. Because I think both in your talk and when we think about Lumbee identity, I think the first thing we think about is recognition of that identity, of course, in this case, by outsiders. How do Lumbee define themselves? What are identities that are important to Lumbee culture? And how, of course, do these identities shift over time?
So I think in many ways for a lot of the Lumbee, perhaps like many other peoples, it is identification of place and family. Family name carries a lot of weight. These are small, tight-knit communities, often struggling economically, and family name encapsulates family honor. It connects people in so that a family name can be connected back. Oh, I knew your grandfather, I knew your grandmother. These traditions have seemed always to be strong, and there's always been a strong identification with place. If we think about the decision of the Lumbee to name themselves not really after a tribal identity, but by the Lumber River, saying, well, this is where we have always made our home, that clear identification with place, I think, is fundamentally important. Now, there's another side. We can see that in more recent times, the various different native tribes in North Carolina have embraced what I would consider a pan-Indian identity. So the sense that perhaps some of the cultural pathways were so stripped from people in such a racist age that some of these traditions get lost. I think we can see a trend toward adopting and making their own some pan-Indian traditions. If we look at the powwows and things like that, we cannot necessarily say with confidence that there were powwows going on at the turn of the century, 100 years ago. What we see is that with a resurgence across the country in pride of being Native American, there are these connections being made. And so you have people like the Lumbee go to the Smithsonian Native American Museum, meet with others up there, connect in, show off their cultural traditions, learn from other Native American cultural traditions, incorporate them into their own. And then as generation passes that tradition down to the next generation, it becomes their own. Superficially, you might look at it and go, oh, this is a borrowed culture. Looking at some aspects of it, you know, some of the traditional regalia may not necessarily have a long, long history, but if you know that your parents have had this history and perhaps their parents before them, then that really is legitimately your own cultural tradition by this point.
So the outward manifestations may change, but the identity and the continuity of that identity endures.
Well, and just to follow up on that,
yes.
I think they get woven into their own narrative, their own story. So, for instance, you can go see Strike Wind for the Lumbee. You can see how they tell the story of Henry Berry Lowry. You have this resistance fighter. You can see their stories of fighting against Ku Klux Klan, violence against them in the late 1950s. And so these all get woven into the tradition of who they are as a people as well.
Emily, do you have questions?
I do, but they're a little bit separate from the topic of identity that you're on.
Well, I think that might enrich the conversation.
Sure. Mr. Massey, I am curious, when you were doing your graduate work at UNC Wilmington, when you were if I remember correctly, you interviewed people who had attended the segregated Lumbee schools, correct?
I did. So I was particularly interested in the experience of desegregation for people who were either teachers, administrators, or students in these segregated all-Indian schools.
And what surprised you the most, or what were some of the most surprising things that you learned when you did these interviews about the desegregation process?
Good question, good question. Number one, I think I was fairly surprised that anyone was willing to talk with me about such personal, sensitive issues. I know I came in very much as an outsider with my English accent. I was also very struck by the fact that I had a steep learning curve. I came in, it's kind of like the liberal Brit, the civil rights movement. This is a movement in the right direction. School desegregation obviously is correcting a tremendous evil that has been inflicted against African Americans. And I never really considered that for Native Americans, school desegregation meant often that their schools would be closed and that their children may well have ended up going to schools that were formerly all black schools, which is exactly the thing that they had fought against in the first place and had built these schools with their own hands out of rough-hewn logs from donated land from within the community. They started as private schools, they started as churches, and for them to have to give up these schools because of Brown versus Board of Education, when they still did not have even state recognition of their separate status, not as mixed people, but as Native American. I think they really had to bear a lot of the burdens of desegregation. And I think beyond that, some of the things that people were talking to me about was that while they recognized the benefit of their children being exposed to a broader world, they were also very anxious. They were anxious about teachers who might be racist. They were anxious about teachers who just wouldn't know their children. When you go from a very close-knit community where the school represents community pride, marching bands, athletic teams, some of the best jobs within the community, and those things are being taken away from you, that was a tremendous threat. So I found that there was about a 50-50 split in terms of whether desegregation was supported or whether it was deemed that the benefits of it were not really worth what they had to give up.
And what were some of the benefits that your interviewees expressed?
In a nutshell, I would say it was that their children would be provided for the first time with textbooks that were not second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand, that they would be going to schools that had cafeterias, they were going to schools that had proper heating systems, they were going to schools that had much better sports facilities. The reason why these schools really shut down was because these buildings, the state of North Carolina had just never put the resources in them, the funding into them that they put into the white schools. So that was a definite benefit for these Native American children.
And were all of your interviewees from the Robeson County area, or did you by chance interview any Lumbee folks who were from other counties?
So the Lumbee were all living around the Pembroke area. I will say I also interviewed a few Coharie, and that was in Sampson County, I believe. You must forgive my memory because this was more years ago than I care to recall. But actually,
Sure.
This was about 1994, so it's been a while. I'm maybe getting some of my facts a little bit muddled here in terms of where they were. But I do remember talking specifically with Coharie and with Lumbee people.
Yeah, and thank you for that information you gave us about your graduate work, because that's extremely applicable where we are. So currently, Dr. Yarborough and I are at our main campus in Hamlet, which is very close to Rockingham, North Carolina, and Richmond County. However, we also serve a satellite campus in Scotland County.
Okay.
And I teach at the satellite campus on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and have worked alongside quite a few Lumbee educators there. So I was just curious if you would happen to interview anybody from that county, but either way, it's still very, very close to Robeson County where you were doing your work.
You'd be amused by the fact that as a poverty-stricken foreign student, I did not own a car, so I had to rent a car every time I was going out to interview.
Oh, wow. And from Wilmington, that would have been a little over an hour.
Yeah.
Each way.
Yeah. What we do to get our degrees, right?
Sure. Yeah, especially when you're trying to track down interview subjects. Yeah, I was telling Dr. Yarborough not long ago that I worked as a reporter for a little over a year before I decided to pursue a career in education. So while I did own a car at that time, fortunately, I still remember the challenge of tracking down people to interview.
Well, I do have to give credit to Dr. Melton McLaurin. He was my thesis advisor, and he did drive me out to Pembroke the first time I went to interview, and accompanied me and talked me through the ethics of interviewing people and recording them, which was very sweet of him to do so.
Oh, definitely. And I remember from when we met a while back that you had started at UNC Wilmington as an undergraduate foreign exchange student. And
actually,
is that correct?
No, I went to University of Southern Mississippi for my junior year. That was my first experience. Flew into New Orleans, and yeah, that was late August of 1990, and that was an incredible experience. Hattiesburg, Mississippi.
And what made you want to pursue studying Native American history in North Carolina?
Well, I was just so fascinated by the complexities. When I was in Mississippi, I really found the history of the African American civil rights movement was particularly dynamic. I'd been used to studying the Crusades and medieval history, which all seemed a little bit dusty and remote compared with the tensions and the bravery that I could see that had happened. And the thing about the civil rights movement that I marveled about was that it was such recent history. And for me, the appeal of moving from thinking about Native Americans in a very stereotypical fashion as a past people, and realizing that no, Native Americans are still very much with us today. They can be wearing jeans and a t-shirt and be in the same school as you, but they are still Native American. I knew I had a lot to learn, and it fascinated me.
And speaking of that desegregation period we were talking about earlier, when you listed some of the advantages of desegregation that your interviewees gave you, what were some of the fears that they communicated?
I think the fears in particular were that their children would be sold short. We all care very deeply about the education of our children. You're too young to have children, but you know what I mean. Not everyone goes to church every Sunday. Not everyone votes necessarily, but we all really, really care deeply about the next generation, the people bearing our name. And I do remember very distinctly from all that time ago, parents talking about how Native American teachers brought uplift to their students. They told them they could be doctors, they could be lawyers, they could be exactly what they wanted to be. And I think they're just fundamentally worried that teachers in a broader community outside of their own tight-knit structures wouldn't have that same love for their children, wouldn't have that same faith in those children being able to achieve whatever they wanted to achieve.
That's certainly an excellent motivation for them to be more open to the desegregation of the schools. Yeah, I saw a lot of parallels there with the desegregation of Black and white schools in other parts of North Carolina. When my father was in middle school in 1973, his school was desegregated over winter break. So he left for winter break with one set of classmates, and when he returned in January, half of his class was African American. It always surprised me, right? Because as a student in U.S. history, we learn about Brown versus Board of Education.
1954.
I talked to him and learned that it did. Yeah, then I learned that it didn't happen in my father's county until 1973. But he had even before desegregation happened, he had African American friends who lived in his neighborhood. He interacted with on an almost daily basis. So it sounds like they communicate, or their parents communicated very similar wants and fears when the schools were desegregated as well.
Right. So the flip side of it that a lot of parents also talked about was that it exposed their children to what they called the real world, and allowed them to make connections with broader communities, often wealthier communities that had more resources than their own. I think that for many of them, reflecting back, some of their initial fears were not borne out, and they realized that actually their children did flourish. There were some that dropped out, but for those that were able to make that transition, some of them obviously have gone on to extraordinary success.
That was the last question I had for you this afternoon, but thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. As Dr. Yarbrough said, I know it's a very busy time of the semester.
Oh, no, thank you. The honor has been mine. I appreciate the invite. Take care.
You too.
Thank you so much.